This is the one time in your life when you will want to know the ending. This webinar will provide you with an in-depth overview of Task 1 of the edTPA, Planning, while at the same time we'll show you how it's connected to Tasks 2 and 3 in the edTPA. My name is Angel Hessel, and I am the edTPA Coordinator at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
And my name is Lori Kroger. I'm the edTPA Coordinator at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh.
Task 1 of the edTPA focuses on planning. Think about it as your intended outcomes. Your planning should reflect what you want your students to learn by the end of your learning segment. A good analogy to consider is if construction workers take the time to build a solid foundation, the end result will be a well-built home. If you take the time to develop solid lesson plans, the final outcome will be increased student learning. Let's highlight the required components in Task 1 of the edTPA, which, by the way, are all reflective of effective lesson planning. In Task 1 of the edTPA, you will provide the reader with your instructional context, all of your lesson plans, your instructional materials, and your planned assessments. You will also provide a written commentary. Effective planning always starts with the end in mind. First, identify what you want your students to learn by the end of your learning segment. Then, work on how will you go about planning your lessons to support your central focus. Now let's take a look at how you will be evaluated in Task 1. We're going to use the elementary literacy rubrics as an example. Please note that you will need to refer to your handbook and carefully examine the rubrics for your content area. Rubric 1 is going to assess your ability to design plans that appropriately address the central focus and build on one another to achieve your intended learning outcomes. Planning to support students with varied needs is addressed in Rubric 2. Here you will show how you differentiated your instruction to support all of your learners' needs. You must specifically and explicitly address your special education students and refer to their IEP or 504 plans. Rubric 3 focuses on how you will use your students' prior knowledge and their cultural, community, and personal assets to plan your lessons. These are the things you know about your students' everyday life experiences, cultural and language backgrounds, and all of their interests. You must plan lessons considering the language demands that might prevent some of your students from having equal access to the content. Rubric 4 addresses your ability to plan your lessons with the academic language demands in mind. Last, but certainly not least, during the planning process, you will develop appropriate assessments that are aligned with your content standards, objectives, and central focus. Keep in mind, these are your planned, not completed student assessments.
Now let's take a look at the next task of the edTPA, instruction. In this task, your evidence will include video clips of your instruction and an instruction commentary. The tasks of the edTPA are interconnected, and planning is the key to opening the door to Task 2. You should plan your learning segment so that you demonstrate your ability to create a positive learning environment, to actively engage students in learning by building on their prior knowledge, and to deepen your students' understanding of the content that you are teaching. Careful planning is also the key to opening the door to Task 3. Here's a quick look at the assessment task. For this task, you will be required to provide an analysis of whole class learning, an analysis and feedback to your focus students, and your assessment commentary. Feedback is an important component of instruction. Don't miss an opportunity to tell your students how they are doing in their learning. Remember that feedback is cyclical. You give it, they use it, you give it again. When planning your lessons, be sure that you consider how you will be able to demonstrate your ability to provide impactful feedback to your students, provide opportunities for your students to use the feedback that you give them to deepen their understanding of the content, and how you will use assessment data to inform instruction every day of your teaching. Let's take a closer look at some specific examples of feedback. Ineffective feedback provides very limited information about what was done and what needs to be improved. For example, writing excellent or giving a letter or a number grade only on a project or an assessment does not give your students any information about what they've done well and what they can do to improve their learning. In opposition to ineffective feedback, impactful feedback gives students information on what they did well and direction about how to correct their errors. It is targeted feedback that aligns with the learning goals and objectives of the lesson. Rather than simply saying, "well done," this work provides specific, useful, and actionable direction for your students to use to understand how they are doing in their learning and what they can do to deepen their understanding of the content that you are teaching. Here are some things to remember about giving feedback. Feedback is not advice. If students are in a safe environment, they will be open to your feedback. Don't underestimate the importance of feedback that your students give to you, and use that feedback to improve your own instruction. Solely giving a grade is not enough feedback. Don't wait until the end of the lesson to give feedback to your students. It's ongoing. Don't rely exclusively on students to give each other feedback. It can be wrong. And students need to know what they are learning to appreciate and use the feedback about their learning. Just like the feedback cycle, the assessment cycle is continuous. First, we identify our learning outcomes and our learning objectives. We specify our assessment process. We give our assessments, collecting and analyzing the data. We share those results with our students. And based on our data from the assessments, we make changes to our instruction to improve student learning and to deepen their understanding of the content. Notice that this does not end. We begin again by identifying new student learning outcomes, objectives, and giving assessments. This is a process that continues cycling over and over throughout the lessons.
Remember that planning is your intended teaching, and even the best laid plans sometimes need to be modified. If your formative assessment data suggests that you're not ready to move on and that your students need more exposure to the content that you are teaching, don't worry. Address the changes and the reason for the changes in Task 2. So at this point, you're ready to begin a checklist of everything that you need to do to complete Task 1. We'll take a list of each of these individually. The first step is to select a focus class. Your teaching event should reflect your work with the same group of students. Let's take a moment to clarify a few things. If you are working with the Special Education Handbook, you will be selecting one focus learner. Ideally, this is a student working toward an academic goal. If you are working with the other handbooks, you are going to select the required number of focus learners, and obviously your handbook will give you this information. There should be students who represent a range of learners, including students with IEPs or 504 plans, English language learners, and students who are struggling to learn the content. The next step for Task 1 is to complete your context for learning. This is where you will clearly describe the learning environment. Make sure that you professionally discuss the classroom practices, the curriculum, and any restrictions. Be sure to divorce yourself from the reader so they have a clear understanding of the context in which you taught. Leave no stone unturned when describing the classroom and your students that you are teaching. Your next job is to identify your learning segment. A learning segment is 3 to 5 consecutive lessons that build upon one another, all supporting the central focus. So what is a central focus? The central focus is the overarching or the big idea for student learning. This is what your students will know and be able to do at the end of your lessons. The next item to complete in Task 1 is to identify the content standards and objectives that will be included in your lessons. In your lesson plans, be sure that you identify the content standard and objectives for each lesson. Select content standards and write your lesson objectives that are aligned to your central focus. The important thing here is alignment, alignment, alignment. Be sure your objectives, standards, and central focus are all connected. If you are using the Special Education Handbook and the student does not have an academic learning target, then all alignment must be to the IEP goal instead. In addition to the importance of alignment, it is equally important to identify the academic language demands in your lesson plans. Language is the vehicle through which we learn. And think about it, if students are not familiar with the language, they cannot be successful in their learning. And we certainly cannot assume that our students are familiar with all of the language we use in our lessons. That's why it's so important that you provide explicit and clear access to the language demands of your lessons. If you're asking yourself, but what does this actually look like? Well, in terms of the requirements of the edTPA, the first thing you're going to want to do is to identify the language functions of your lesson. A little hint is to look at the verbs in your lesson objectives and content standards. The second thing you will be required to do is to identify all of the vocabulary words of the lesson and think about how you're going to introduce those. And last, but certainly not least, you're going to identify one additional language demand, and it's going to be your choice. You can either focus on syntax or discourse.
Syntax is the set of conventions for organizing symbols, words, and phrases together into structures. So in music, this is going to be your notes. In math, it's going to be all of the mathematical symbols that are used to represent problems. It's going to look different depending on the discipline. Discourse addresses how members of a discipline talk and write. So, for example, if you're teaching mathematics, you're going to prepare students to talk within that discipline using that language, which is going to be very different than if you are preparing a historian.
If you are working with the Early Childhood Handbook, your requirement is to identify the vocabulary words of the lesson.
If you're working with the World Languages Handbook, it's important to remember that teaching world languages is teaching academic language. Syntax and discourse are embedded in everything you do with your students, so there is no academic language requirement in the edTPA. That's why you have 2 less rubrics.
If you are working with the Special Education Handbook, you are not working with academic language. Rather, you are focusing on a communication skill. Identify the communication skill of the lesson. Hint, look at the verbs of your lesson objectives and content standards, or identify the vocabulary words of the lesson. Now that you know what academic language is, let's think about how you can support your students with academic language development. A way to accomplish this is to think about incorporating support tools in your planning process. So for example, you may want to give your students writing organizers, story starters, or KWL charts. These are all tools that will help your students to practice the language demands.
One final thing to remember as you are beginning to plan your lessons is to plan the assessment of student learning. It's important to plan the assessments prior to planning the instruction. You need to know what the outcome of the learning will look like before you can plan the instruction. Let's take a close look at the assessment requirements in the various handbooks. The assessment requirements for the Special Education Handbook require that you establish baseline data for your focus learner. This is what your student knows and can do prior to teaching the learning segment. You're also required to collect daily performance data, a running record of your focus learner's progress. The final requirement is to analyze assessment data throughout the learning segment. This is best done through a chart or a graph, so be sure to consider what type of data you can collect that will be most beneficial to doing this. For example, points gained from baseline data to the final assessment. The assessment requirements for all of the other handbooks require that you select the required number of focus students that represent a range of learners. These are the same range that we discussed earlier. Be sure that you analyze the data of the entire class in terms of whole class learning, and then deeply analyze the learning outcomes of your focus students. This is where you cite specific evidence from the selected assessment that clearly shows the connections between your teaching and your students' outcomes. Remember, if things don't go as planned, you will have an opportunity to address this in the commentary for Task 2. Once you begin writing your lesson plans, make sure that you've checked that all of the required components have been met. Make sure that you have aligned your assessments to your objectives, your content standards, and your central focus. All 4 of those pieces need to align with each other. Save your full rationale for the planning commentary, and make sure that your lesson plans are no more than 4 pages long per lesson.
Remember that for Task 1, you will also be asked to include evidence of your planning. You will select key instructional materials for each lesson. This might include handouts, assignments, slides, and whiteboard images, any of the things you've used during your teaching with your students that show the instruction that you've delivered. This evidence should be no more than 5 pages per lesson plan. Once you have completed all of the tasks we've talked about, you're ready to begin writing Task 1 commentary. A few words of advice. Be sure to answer all of the prompts. Consistently provide evidence by citing specific examples from your lesson plans. Write in straightforward, simple prose. And make sure that you watch the page limits. Remember, no more than 9 pages, including the prompts.
In the Task 1 commentary, you will be asked to justify your planning decisions. Remember that you need to draw upon the theory and research that you learned throughout your education preparation program to address this prompt. Excellent educators don't do what they do because it's easy or it looks good to an administrator. Excellent educators plan, instruct, and assess the way they do because their decisions are rooted in best practice that is grounded in theory and research. We hope that this webinar has been helpful to increase your understanding of the cycle of instructional practice and assessment that must be considered and acted upon. After all, this is what good teaching is all about.
We may have spoiled the ending, but now you know the whole story.